Today we will be stitching block 6A and block 6A mirrored. This is actually block 6A, and the video will show block 6A mirrored, so it'll look just like this except mirrored. The supplies you will need is your battleizer hooped up and ready to go. If you're using wool, you'll need your piece of wool. You'll need your fabric 1, 2 pieces of fabric 3, fabric 4, fabric 5, fabric 6, and 7. So every color will be used in this block, plus you'll need your back. You'll need your thread A with a bobbin, thread B, thread C with a bobbin, thread D, thread E with a bobbin, thread F with a bobbin, thread G with a bobbin, and your wash away thread. Let's get started. For step 1, I put a contrasting thread in the needle, and we're going to stitch the placement stitch onto the battleizer. Optional batting time. So if you opt to do the batting underneath your stitching on your blocks, this is what we recommend you do. This is a little square of wool batting, and what we recommend you do is place it on your ironing board, put a press cloth over it, and then with your iron just press the 4 edges. You can see through the press cloth. So I'm just pressing the 4 edges. It compresses those and keeps your foot from getting caught on the batting when you stitch it down. So you can hopefully see the impression here. So when I peel this off, we put a press cloth on because it will stick to your iron otherwise. So we have nice compressed edges along the edges of your batting. So do that first before you continue on. Step number 3 is to take our fabric 7 and place it over the wool batting. You want your outside edges to extend about 1/2 inch, and the machine will stitch the tack down with the wash away thread. So now we're ready to trim away the excess of our fabric 7. So I'm going to take a clip here and just trim, leaving about 1/8 of an inch, and cut off around about in that area. Our next step is to take fabric 2 and place it in this lower corner. Again, you're going to leave about 1/2 inch hanging over, and the machine will stitch another tack down. Time to trim the fabric from step number 4. So I'll take a clip in here, a clip in here, and we'll leave about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance above this curve. So we're ready for step 5. It's still wash away thread. It's going to stitch a little placement stitch in this area for our next step. For step 6, we will place the small square of fabric 3 directly over the placement stitch. We'll keep water soluble thread in the machine and let it tack down the applique. We're ready to go ahead and trim the stitching from step 6. I'm going to show you my other block. You can see we leave the fabric within the seam allowance, because that way we won't have a raw edge when we sew these together. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this real close around these curved edges, and we'll be right back. All trimmed up and ready to go, leaving this within the seam allowance. So leave the water soluble thread in the needle only, and for step 7 we're going to stitch a placement stitch up in this area. So for step 8, we'll take this little piece of fabric 5 and place it over the placement stitch, making sure you extend into your seam allowance and let the machine sew the tack down. Now we just need to trim away really close inside the block, and again we'll leave this in the seam allowance. Step number 9, we're going to leave wash away thread in the needle, and it'll stitch more placement stitches in this area right here. For step number 10, we will place our larger rectangle of fabric 3 over the placement stitches, keeping water soluble thread in the needle, and stitch the tack down. So we need to trim all of these around all the edges real close because they're appliques. So when I get that done, we'll be right back. So I just completed trimming from step number 10, and I wanted to point out again, we left fabric in the seam allowance here and here, and also this area will be covered up later, so I left a little bit extra there, but the rest is all trimmed very close for applique. So for step 11, the machine will stitch a placement stitch here for a flower, and after that we'll place fabric 4 over that, and we'll let it tack it down, and we'll trim that one. So we'll be right back when that's finished. Step number 12, we're going to place fabric 4 directly over the placement stitch of this flower, making sure your fabric is extended into the seam allowance, keeping water soluble thread in the sewing machine, and we'll stitch the tack down stitches. I've gone ahead and trimmed really close for applique from step number 12, noticing again I've left the fabric in the seam allowance. And I've also gone ahead and done step 13, which was the placement stitch. And step 14 will be to take your small piece of fabric 1, place it over this placement stitch, and let the machine sew the tack down, continuing with water-soluble thread. Step number 15, continuing with the water-soluble thread, we'll stitch a placement stitch in this area. And then step 16 will be to take a piece of fabric 5, place it over that area, and the machine will tack it down, and then we'll go ahead and trim it. So here you can see we've gone ahead and tacked down our fabric from step 16, and I've also gone ahead and stitched step 17, which is the placement stitch for the flower up in the corner. After that, for step 18, we will take our fabric scrap, that's the leftover from this step that we did way back, and we will place it over this corner, extending into the seam allowance, and let it tack down that flower. So I've gone ahead and trimmed out the fabric around the little daisy, and again pointing out that we've left the fabric within the seam allowance. And next step is step 19, and we will place thread E in the needle only, and we will stitch some satin stitches in this area. We'll also do a little bit of satin stitch in this area. So we'll get that going, and we'll be right back with our next step. For step 20, you will put thread C in the needle only, and it'll stitch the satin stitch around these areas right here. For step 21, we will put thread D in the needle, and it'll do the satin stitch around the daisy and also the satin stitch around this flower right there. For step 22, we will put thread A in the needle only, and it'll do the satin stitching around this flower and some detail on the flower. Step 23, we will place our thread F in the needle only, and it'll stitch some cute little dots in this area right here. Time for step 24, which will place fabric 6 over this open area. We'll put wash away thread in the needle only and tack down the fabric. So as you can see, I went ahead and trimmed away all the excess fabric around step number 24 very close. We didn't have to worry about leaving anything in the seam allowance on this one. For step 25, we will place our backing on the back side of the hoop. So I'll turn the hoop over and place this over the embroidery in the back. Put it back on the machine, continue with the water-soluble thread, and stitch the back on. For step 26, we're going to place thread A in the needle and the bobbin, and the machine will do some quilting. Now would be a great place to go ahead and turn off your thread cutter on your machine if you have that feature available, so you have a nice tidy looking back. For step 27, we will place thread G in the needle and the bobbin, and the machine will stitch some little curly Q stitches in this area here. For step 28, we will place thread F in the needle and the bobbin, and the machine will stitch the satin stitch around this area right here, and also do some quilting from Sharon Chamber. We're ready for step 29, and we will place thread E in the needle and the bobbin, and the machine will do some more quilting. So for step number 30, we will place thread G in the needle and the bobbin, and the machine will do some of Sharon Chamber's beautiful quilting. Last step for block 6 is step 31. We will place thread C in the needle and the bobbin, and we'll do a little bit of quilting in the corner. So we're ready to go ahead and trim up block 6A mirrored, and all 4 edges will be trimmed using the trimmer by George. So I'm going to pull back the top layer of the block, place the trimmer metal edge, this is the metal edge, place it against the stitching line, and give it a little back and forth action. Go ahead and give my battleizer a little tug, and I will go ahead and trim off all the battleizer and the backing from around the block. And I'm going to do that on all 4 sides. Making sure I have no fabric here sticking out. So once I get all the batting and the backing trimmed off, now it's time, here's a look at it. So you can see there's no battleizer or backing on the back of the block at all. Now we're going to trim the front, these edges here that are kind of not too tighty. Turn our trimmer over, and we have a 1/4 inch line. We're going to go ahead and put the 1/4 inch line on the final outline and trim off all the excess fabric. So now we have, this is our mirrored block 6, and this is our regular block 6. So there you have it. On to the next one.